Half of everything America shipped to the Soviet Union in the Second World War went through a single port. 8.2 million tons of food, trucks, locomotives and raw materials into Vladivostok within sight of Japanese-controlled waters on Soviet ships that Japanese inspectors had the right to stop and board. They stopped some. They boarded some. They let almost all of it through. The entire route survived on one piece of paper, the Neutrality Pact Japan and the Soviet Union signed in April 1941. Hitler spent the rest of the war trying to get Tokyo to tear that paper up. Tokyo never did. This video asks the question Hitler kept asking. What happens if Japan turns north? In July 1941, 2 weeks after the German invasion began, the Japanese Army General Staff put a plan on the Emperor's desk for the invasion of the Soviet Far East. It had a name, Kantokuen, the Kwantung Army Special Maneuvers. It called for up to 25 divisions. The build-up doubled Japanese strength in Manchuria to over 700,000 men in a matter of weeks. On the 7th of July, Hirohito gave the build-up his sanction. The invasion of Siberia was staffed, supplied, and waiting on a single order from Tokyo. The order never came, and the reasons it never came are the honest core of this question. Japanese planners called their approach the ripe persimmon strategy. Wait for the Soviet Union to rot under the German blow, then pick the Far East off the branch without a fight. The persimmon never ripened. The Red Army in the East stayed intact through the summer. In Tokyo, the loudest voice for war lost his job over the delay. Foreign Minister Matsuoka dismissed in July, the same man who had personally negotiated the Neutrality Pact with Moscow 10 weeks earlier and now wanted it torn up. Japan's own planners calculated that the opening blow would consume 2/3 of the army's entire ammunition reserve. The first move of a war they admitted could not be won by force alone. When a logistics colonel warned the general staff that the Kwantung Army had nowhere to shelter its men through a Siberian winter, the plan's chief architect, Operations Chief Shinichi Tanaka, reportedly screamed at him and slapped him across the face. Then, the army quietly pulled back from the frontier anyway, because the colonel was right. By August, the window was closing. By October, Tokyo had chosen the Pacific. But for roughly 6 weeks in the summer of 1941, the largest combined operation in Japanese history sat loaded and aimed at Siberia. If you've seen our video on what happens when Germany fights only the Soviet Union, this is the other half of that question, the ally Hitler actually had instead of the fronts he didn't need. Subscribe, and let's run it properly. Because the first thing this scenario touches is the most famous rescue of the war. One variable changes. Everything else holds. Germany still invades in June. Britain still fights on. America still embargoes Japan in July. The only switch flips in Tokyo. The army faction wins the argument. Kantokuen launches in August 1941. And Pearl Harbor never happens. No Pacific War. No American entry in December. That single flip pulls on 3 threads: the Siberian divisions, the Vladivostok pipeline, and Stalin's own decision-making. Take them in order. The story runs like this. In the autumn of 1941, a Soviet spy in Tokyo named Richard Sorge learned that Japan had chosen the Pacific over Siberia. In July, he had wired Moscow the terms of the whole question. If the Red Army suffers defeat, Japan joins the war, and if there is no defeat, Japan stays neutral. On the 14th of September, he sent the answer. The danger of a Japanese attack had passed. Stalin, freed from his 2-front nightmare, moved his Far Eastern divisions west, 15 infantry divisions, 3 cavalry divisions, 1,700 tanks, 1,500 aircraft. Fresh Siberian troops in white winter camouflage arrived at the gates of Moscow in December, broke the exhausted German advance, and saved the capital. The telegrams survive in the military archive with Stalin's initials on them, next to Molotovs and Berias. Wehrmacht veterans remembered the cry that went down the line that winter. The Siberians are coming. The numbers in that story rest on documents, and when historians started tracking the actual divisions unit by unit, the story got weaker with every file they opened. Count them. Between August and December 1941, roughly 14 divisions transferred west from the Far East against 75 to 90 fresh divisions raised from the Soviet interior in the same stretch. Some of the units popularly credited with the rescue never fired a shot for Moscow at all. The 91st and 166th genuine Far Eastern divisions had already been moved west before Barbarossa even began, for reasons that had nothing to do with Sorge or Japan, and were destroyed in the Vyazma encirclement in October. Weeks before the battle, they get credited with winning. The one division that legitimately earns the legend, the 32nd Rifle at Borodino, had spent 7 years on the Manchurian border and fought the Japanese directly at Lake Khasan in 1938, real Far Eastern troops holding real Far Eastern ground against Das Reich and the 10th Panzer. It also happened to be one veteran division swallowed inside a Soviet mobilization machine that was raising dozens of new ones every month regardless of what Tokyo decided. So the first honest answer: removing the Siberian divisions removes less than the legend claims. Moscow was defended in December by an army that was mostly already there, backed by reserves the Soviet system generated faster than German intelligence could count them. If the counterfactual ended at the divisions, it would barely move the war. It doesn't end there. The divisions were the famous thread. Forget them for a moment. Every month, for 4 years, Soviet freighters loaded with cargo sailed past Japanese patrol craft into Vladivostok, and Tokyo waved them through. That's the same 8.2 million tons already mentioned, roughly half of everything the Western Allies sent, just barely more than the Arctic convoys and the Persian corridor combined. This is the lever that actually moves the war. The Arctic route everyone knows from the documentaries carried under a quarter of the total and lost ships doing it. The Pacific route lost almost nothing because Tokyo chose to honor the pact rather than risk a two-front war it could not afford. The Neutrality Pact was signed for 5 years and held for most of the war, denounced by Moscow only in the last spring of the fighting. A Japanese invasion closes the Pacific route on day 1, and it closes the version of Lend-Lease the Soviet Union could least afford to lose. Because of the pact's rules, the Pacific route avoided obvious weapons systems, tanks, guns, finished ordnance. It carried the war's boring cargo instead. Food when the Ukraine's harvest was gone. Trucks when Soviet factories were building tanks instead. Locomotives, rails, the aluminum that framed the Il-2 ground attack aircraft, explosives components. Around a third of the Red Army's explosives came from Western supply. The offensives that destroyed Army Group Center in 1944 rode on American trucks. Strip the Pacific route out of the ledger, and the Red Army of 1943 and 44 is slower, hungrier, and shorter of ammunition, whatever happens at Moscow in 1941. One honest caveat, and it cuts against the drama. The route's peak years were 1943 to 45. In December 1941, it was barely a trickle. Closing it doesn't lose Stalin the Battle of Moscow. It bleeds him through every year after it. Khalkhin Gol had already answered whether Japan could win this fight. In 1939, Japanese infantry threw themselves at Soviet armor and massed artillery on the Mongolian border and lost badly enough that every officer in the Kwantung Army still remembered it 2 years later. The Far East was never undefended either. Even at the worst of the Moscow crisis, the garrison never dropped below roughly 40 divisions worth of men, dug into terrain they had fortified for a decade against an army that had already beaten them once. The war eventually ran this experiment for real, and the result deserves a place in any honest version of the counterfactual. In August 1945, the Red Army finally attacked the Kwantung Army with 1.5 million men, over 5,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, and nearly 4,000 aircraft, a force comparable in scale to the one Hitler had sent into Russia in 1941. Manchuria, an area the size of Western Europe, fell in 11 days. The 1945 matchup isn't a fair test of the 1941 scenario in either direction. The Soviets were 4 years better, and the Kwantung Army 4 years worse, stripped of its best veterans to feed the Pacific Island campaigns. But the direction of the mismatch was never in doubt at any point in the war. Even the Kwantung Army of 1941 at full strength was fighting with tanks whose guns couldn't punch through a T-34's armor. When these two armies met at full commitment, it was not close. There wasn't much of a prize waiting either. Japan already had a working oil concession on Sakhalin, an island half Japanese, half Soviet, that had been pumping crude to Japan since the 1920s. That deal existed precisely because it was safer than a war. The oil that would have made mainland Siberia worth invading, the fields that made West Siberia the Soviet Union's economic engine for the rest of the century, was not discovered until the 1950s. In August 1941, Japan had somewhere between 1 and 2 years of fuel depending on which reserves you count, and an American embargo tightening by the month. The Dutch East Indies had oil in the ground already, and tankers to move it. Mainland Siberia had permafrost, and a resource that wouldn't exist for another decade. An army that invades Siberia instead of the south solves none of its problems and runs its tanks dry by 1943. And Japan hadn't finished its first war yet. 4 years into China, millions of men committed, no victory in sight. Kantokuen would have opened a second land front for a country that had not closed its first. So the likely military result is a grinding border war, fought for territory Japan cannot use, that never gets within reach of Lake Baikal. The value to Hitler was Japanese pressure, 40 Soviet divisions and 1,000 aircraft pinned in the east, and a pipeline cut. That much, even a failing Japanese offensive delivers. There is one more thread, and it points the wrong way for Germany. Soviet overconfidence in early 1942 was expensive. The Kharkov offensive in May, launched by a leadership that believed the crisis had passed, collapsed into an encirclement that cost 250,000 men and opened the road to Stalingrad. That recklessness came from a Stalin who felt secure in the east above all. Put a Japanese army on his Pacific frontier and that security is gone. A two-front Stalin is a careful Stalin. The reserves stay deeper, the gambles get smaller. The Kharkov disaster, the one gift Soviet command handed Germany in 1942, may never be offered. It's the same logic that explains Stalin's overconfidence in the first place, just run in reverse. Take away the sense of safety in the east, and the recklessness in the west may never happen either. The counterfactual gives Hitler a pinned garrison and a cut pipeline. It may also take away the only year in which Soviet mistakes were winning him the war. Germany and Japan fought 2 separate wars that happened to share enemies. No shared plans, no coordinated offensives. Hitler learned of Pearl Harbor from a radio flash at the Wolf's Lair. Tokyo learned of Barbarossa from its own ambassador in Berlin. Neither ally was consulted before the other moved. The version of this war where they strike the Soviet Union together needed a different axis than the one that existed, an alliance instead of a coincidence of enemies. That axis only ever existed on propaganda posters. So weigh it yourself. Does Japan striking north hand Hitler Moscow, or just hand Stalin a reason to stop making mistakes? If this is the version of the war you want more of, hit subscribe. Thanks for watching.